Now, you've been a member of the Medical Society for a long time, joined in the early 1980s. How has the society changed during your years? What can you note regarding your involvement or regarding, how the society has changed?
Well, first of all, the reason I joined the Medical Society was that my father gave me some advice, which was, son, wherever you decide to practice, join your state medical society. It's the only common voice we have for the common good. Dad had been a member of the Camden County Medical Society of the New Jersey Medical Society from the time he finished his military service and residency in 1949 and moved back to Camden where he'd grown up until he finished his practice in 1989. And he'd entered medical school in '41, a couple of months before the war started. And I watched my father as a solo practitioner, a cardiologist, but who did predominantly primary care and ran the heart station for the local hospital. I'd watch him read 100 electrocardiograms in a morning manually. And my roommate from medical school said, he doesn't read electrocardiograms. He looks at them the way an art critic looks at paintings. And Dad did publish a couple of articles on interesting dysrhythmias. But it is true. I mean, this is the one place where you can meet with other people who are dealing with the same issues and problems that you have. And you'd be surprised how much overlap there is between the practice world of the academic physician in Boston and the practice world of the primary care solo practitioner in rural parts of the Commonwealth. And this is important. One of the things that the Medical Society did that impressed me was that the Committee on Legislation, which works very hard and has been superbly chaired over the past years that I've been involved, looks at all legislation that is being proposed. And sometimes the legislation proposed is absolutely, totally unworkable. And they take this and they discuss it, revise it, review it, and then bring it to the legislature to come up with something that is actually workable and manageable. I won't go into the details now, but the online opioid registry that we all have to go to if one is prescribing a narcotic or other controlled substance, the original legislation was almost impossible to fold into practice. What eventually came out was a reasonable working compromise. And that affects the academic physician who's going to their clinic several days a week as much as the primary care physician who is seeing patients in their office every day. And so it really is a common denominator to try to make things more workable. Our motto, every physician matters, each patient counts, is absolutely true and critical. That's the way we look at it. And so I watched it. I first started out just as a member and then became a delegate for Suffolk. And the story of how I ended up president at Suffolk is actually interesting. Peter Kang, one of the neurologists at Children's, whom I was trying to get to do a consult on one of my patients, we stopped in the hall and he said, look, Hank, the current vice president of the district has to resign for personal reasons and can't do it. Look, could you just step in and be vice president for, it'll be 6 months, and there won't be really that much that you have to do and it will really help us out. Well, I got my consult and I agreed to be vice president. What Peter didn't tell me was that he was running for secretary-treasurer of the Mass Medical Society, which he won, causing him to have to step down as president. And I found myself president of the Medical Society of the district, Medical Society, Suffolk, which I did for 2 years. But this really got me into the thick of it and got me into spending time in the Committee on Legislation, the Board of Trustees. I really began to get a much better idea of the activities necessary to achieve the goals of the Medical Society. And it got me more and more interested in taking a larger and larger role. culminating in my running for vice president. And that started me on my road to the presidency.
Sure.
But there were several things that I learned along the way. First of all, the medical society staff are truly unbelievable. They spoil you for any other staff you could possibly have in any other venue. And they go out of their way to do everything they can to make it work. The other thing is that all of the past presidents will absolutely, at the drop of a hat, without question, respond to any request from the president. No ifs, ands, or buts. If you ask for help with something, they do it, because they've all been in that chair, and they all know that there are times when you're expected to be in 4 different interviews simultaneously, and as good as you are, you can't do that. I had tremendous support from past presidents, and have tried to contribute in the same way to the current officers. It really is an organization of volunteers, because yes, the staff are paid, but all of the officers, the officers do get a stipend, which in most part doesn't compensate the lost time from practice, because when I became vice president, I stepped down as Cystic Fibrosis Center Director at Children's. I became co-director for research for the center. But it was clear that the activities as vice president, I couldn't stay on top of what I was trying to do with the CF Center. And when I became president-elect, I resigned as clinical chief of the division at Children's, because I knew the time that was needed to spend on this job precluded that. And so I went half-time when I became president, and stepped back from clinic and inpatient attending. I still see patients predominantly in the concept of our clinical trials research. We have been, last year we were the #1 clinical research enrolling program in cystic fibrosis in the United States. And, but you can't do everything, and you have to look at the work that's necessary and lay off. I say at my age, you pick up something new, you lay off something old. You can't just do everything that you thought you could do when you were in your 30s.
Right. Well, this is a good moment to transition to getting a snapshot of your practice. And you trained in pediatrics and pulmonology. You've honed in on that into cystic fibrosis in particular. Talk a little bit about your practice and how that goes.
Well, I finished my 4 years at Hopkins in '74 and stayed on as an intern and resident in pediatrics till '77. And thought I was going to be going into the military, but the war ended and the military told me they weren't going to need me. My goal had always been to go into neonatology and run my own unit. But at the time, I said, you know, neonatologists don't really, this was 1977, don't really know that much about the lung. Maybe I'll study the lung for a couple of years before I go into neonatology. So I came up to Boston Children's. I was sent up here by the late Dr. Richard Talamo. Dick Talamo was a Harvard undergrad, BU graduate from the medical school, a Worcester native, and one of the brilliant people. He went 11 years from being assistant professor of pediatrics at the Mass General to becoming chairman of the Department of Pediatrics at Tufts, in between stopping to be a full professor of pulmonary medicine in the Department of Pediatrics at Johns Hopkins. And he was the kind of role model that you just said, I'd like to try to be like him. And he sent me up to Children's to do my fellowship, which I did from '77 to '80. And I stayed on the faculty at Children's for 1 year. And then I was trying to figure out how to stay in Boston. At the time, my wife was principal harp of the Opera Company of Boston with Sarah Caldwell. She said, you know how many harp jobs there are in a city? And I have one. You know how many academic medicine jobs there are? She said, find a job, you're living here. So I was looking around, and Dick Talamo had just been offered the job to pick up from Sidney Gellis and be chairman of pediatrics at Tufts. He said, Hank, I don't have a pulmonary division. I said, okay, when do I start? He said, well, you're supposed to negotiate something. I said, Dick, I told you in Baltimore, you call, I come. And so I started at Tufts in '81 and created the Division of Respiratory Diseases in the Department of Pediatrics and built up their CF Center. I was there for 21 years and left as professor of pediatrics at Tufts. And Alan Ezekowitz dragged me over to the General because they wanted to have a cystic fibrosis therapeutic development center, which they didn't have. And so I became the head of the Joey O'Donnell CF Center and brought their first Cystic Fibrosis Foundation Therapeutic Development Center there. And I was there for 6 years when Gary Fleischer, the chairman at Children's, dragged me back over to Children's as clinical chief of the Division of Respiratory Diseases and CF Center director. My wife said I could go to any hospital I wanted as long as she didn't have to move out of Newton.
Right.
I was offered a couple of very interesting jobs outside of Route 128, outside of Massachusetts. I think she looked at some of those offers and then looked at me and said, please write often.
Right.
And so that made it clear that I was going to stay in Massachusetts, which I've never regretted.
What drew you to cystic fibrosis?
First patient I ever lost was a patient, a 6-year-old child of Dick Talamo's and Beryl Rosenstein's. They were the CF Center directors. And it was just awful to watch this lovely child succumb to this disease. And I knew that this was something that Dick Talamo was not only very interested in, he was a former chairman of the Medical Advisory Council of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation nationally. I'm on that council now, not as chairman, but as chairman of the Professional Education Committee for the foundation. And you basically saw how this disease affected them. You saw the work that he and his friend Beryl Rosenstein were doing, and you just said, I want to do that.
You need to help. Sure.
And that's why they sent me up to Denise Streeter, Mary Ellen Woll, and Harry Schwachman.
It's interesting, you know, the incredible role that mentors play in the evolution of people's careers. It's not something you can always plan for, but yet it's probably one of the most important things that occurs that sets our direction in life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going into internal medicine and cardiology to go into practice with my father, and he said, don't do that. If you come in with me, you'll do all the work and I'll take half the money. I think you should find something else to do.
Okay.
And there were mentors in pediatrics at Hopkins. I mean, I can remember sitting there with Helen Taussig, and these people were just unbelievable. Dick Talamo, Helen Taussig. A funny story, because shortly after I'd gone to Tufts, and my secretary said, there's a Dr. Mary Ellen Avery on the phone. Do you want me to take a message? I said, no, I'll take it.
Right.
I said, yes, Dr. Avery. And she said, Henry, she was one of the few people who got away with calling me Henry. I've got John Littlefield coming up from Hopkins to give the Canon Ely lecture, and then we're going to have a dinner for the Hopkins people at my private club, the Children Club. Would you and your wife like to come? Yes, Dr. Avery. So on the appointed, after the lecture, we went to the dinner, and she had Charlie Janeway's widow, because Charlie had been a house officer at Hopkins and she'd been a social worker there. She had John Krigler for Krigler-Nadger syndrome. He'd been a house officer there. And Helen Taussig was there. And John Littlefield had just come down from the General to be chief of pediatrics at Hopkins the year I was a senior resident. So he hadn't been there long. He wanted a flavor of the early days at Hopkins. And he turned at one point to Helen Taussig, who's the mother of pediatric cardiology in the United States. If Alex Nadis at Children's is the father, then she was the mother, and said to her, why did you go into pediatric cardiology? I'm sure she had that question asked a dozen, 100 times. She said, well, most people knew that I was mostly deaf and that I tried to use electronic stethoscopes early on with vacuum tubes, didn't work very well. And I made most of my diagnoses with palpation and fluoroscopy.
Mm-hmm.
My father had been in the fluoro suite with her when he was a medical student at Hopkins. He said it was witchcraft, it wasn't medicine. She would palpate the chest several different ways, turn the kid under fluoro, describe exactly what the anomalies would be, and when the child died and went to autopsy, it was exactly as she described it.
Mm-hmm.
And then she said something I didn't know. She said, what most people didn't know was that I was also dyslexic. I didn't want to go into a field where there was a large literature that I would have to read to get into it. Then her voice changed and she said, I wanted to go into a field where I could do all the writing. As we walked out of there afterwards, my wife, who's no slouch, I mean, she's a Harvard grad and also a Curtis Institute of Music grad, said, well, that's your basic mind-blowing experience. And it was. I mean, but this really gave you a flavor of the place.
Yeah.
I mean, my father used to tell stories of CPCs being given by Louis Hammond and Arnold Rich. And he said the pearls were dropping before the swine constantly. It was unbelievable. And so you look for role models like that. And I found it in Dick Talamo
You were lucky.
and Beryl Rosenberg.